and welcome to the 534th episode of Shakesyear. I sort of feel like I should make one of those charts where it's like you're a super Shakespeare nerd if you've seen these episodes, and like you click off the ones and it's like you've only seen 84, so you know nothing. Anyway, sorry. Side note, so today we are still working on Henry VI Part 3, and we get to hear from Edward, Earl of March. And it's important to note that this is Edward, Earl of March, who is the eldest son of the recently killed Duke of York. So Edward could also be considered the Duke of York, except they haven't like officially given him the title, probably because his dad was killed for like being a traitor to the crown. But anyway, Edward, if we're following the King Henry gives the crown to the York family once he's dead, then Edward would be next in line now that the Duke of York has been killed. So Edward, Earl of March versus King Henry's eldest son, who is also named Edward, who a little bit earlier in the scene, I forgot to mention yesterday, gets knighted because they need to give him a something, because we had Clifford giving a very impassioned speech for why Henry should take back the Act of Parliament that gave the crown to the York party once Henry dies. So they're like, and he's like, well, at the very least, knight your kid. So Edward, Prince of Wales, is now a knight. Edward, Earl of March, from the York side, wants to become king. So that's sort of what's going on here. We have this very impassioned, you should re-inherit your son instead of disinheriting your son. And then the king was like, actually, no, like, you don't know what you're talking about. I'm actually doing him a favor by saving him from the life of being a king. And then a messenger comes in and says Warwick and Edward, Earl of March, and Richard and a whole bunch of people are headed your way, and they're waving their flags. They're gonna, undo everything. And there's a little bit of smack talk here where they're like, Your Highness, you should get out of here because the queen actually does better when you're not around. And he's like, actually, she's fighting on my behalf now, so I'm gonna stick around. So Warwick and Edward, Earl of March, and Richard and all of the Yorkists come in, and we get into the same little tit for tat thing that we had before, where the king is like, are you going to bow to me? And Edward's like, actually, you should bow to me because I'm your sovereign, because you broke your oath, because now my dad is dead. And then there's like yelling at Clifford, you're a child murderer, and he's like, but I killed the Duke of York. And they're like, yeah, and his son Rutland, who was the youngest, so you're a child murderer. And like all of this smack talk back and forth until finally the king is like, everybody hush and please let me say something. To which just about everybody else in the room goes, no, shut up, shut your face, you don't know what you're talking about. So now the king is not even allowed to speak. The king is not allowed to like try to put a lid on this anymore. And the smack talk just keeps escalating and escalating and escalating, and they're getting very personal, and they're calling each other names, and the queen is like, all of you are worthless and blah, blah, blah. And then Edward, Earl of March, pipes up and says, a wisp of straw were worth 1,000 crowns to make this shameless callet know herself. Helen of Greece was fairer far than thou, although thy husband may be Menelaus. And ne'er was Agamemnon's brother wronged by that false woman as this king by thee. His father reveled in the heart of France and tamed the king and made the Dauphin stoop. And had he matched according to his state, he might have kept that glory to this day. But when he took a beggar to his bed and graced thy poor sire with his bridal day, even then that sunshine brewed a shower for him that washed his father's fortunes forth of France and heaped sedition on his crown at home. For what hath broached this tumult but thy pride? Hadst thou been meek, our title still had slept, and we, in pity of the gentle king, had slipped our claim until another age. Which is a really interesting perspective, because we've been so focused so far on the fact that Henry disinherited his son in order to quell the argument, in order to end the War of the Roses. that nobody until this point has pointed a finger at the queen and said, you're the one that's making a big deal out of that. So if you would just let the king disinherit his son and quell this argument, then we would have just let the king be the king and live out his life and let things go on. Like, you're the one that now has started this little bit of war. At which point George, which I always forget to mention George is actually the second eldest son of the Duke of York, who was just killed. So it's Edward, George, then Richard, then Rutland, who died. But George is kind of absent up until this point. He doesn't show up until after all of this stuff. He pipes up and he's like, yeah, lady, see what my brother's talking about? Like, you're not a good person. And they try to just dispel the things, but Edward, Earl of March, at this point is like, no, there's no saving this. We're going to war. One of us is going to die over this because you're just, no, we're going to war. And that's kind of how the scene ends. They decide that they're going to go to war because they have to go back to war because nobody can talk about this and sort it out with their words. Nobody's actually using their words. They're just throwing insults at each other, which is an interesting place to get to, considering the king just tried to step in and quell things with his words and was told by everyone to shut up. Think that might be important later? Think that might be important? Maybe. I don't know. Anyway, tomorrow we move on. Can you believe that we're only in Act 2? Like, so much has happened in this play. And we just finished Act 2, Scene 2. Anyway, I love it. I will see you tomorrow for more. Mwah.